Good evening. Welcome to the Berry Center's Josephine Artery Foundation Distinguished Lecture Series. This series of talks presents agrarian topics from the perspective of experienced and knowledgeable people from our area, Henry County, Kentucky. I'm Michelle Guthrie, Director of the Archives and Library at the Berry Center. Our partnership with Sterling College in Vermont is an undergraduate degree in sustainable agriculture. Classes during the junior and senior years are held here in Henry County. As you would expect, many of the courses consist of practical instruction in farming, forestry, draft power, good land stewardship, community, and civic involvement. But just as important, the Wendell-Berry Farming Program of Sterling College uses the humanities as a critical starting point, and also covers topics in the social, natural, and formal sciences, modeling the ideal of a liberal arts education which dates from ancient times when it was the education considered to be essential for a free individual, a course of study entered upon for the sake of excellence in intellectual development and citizenship. Tonight's presentation, part of our observance of Earth Day, as well as the year-long celebration of our 10th anniversary and in honor of the graduation of our first cohort, is The Liberal Arts Farmer, about the work of farming education and how the liberal arts contribute to that education. It is presented by Dr. Leah Bayens of Sterling College. Dr. Bayens is the Dean of and a teacher in Sterling's Wendell-Berry Farming Program. In 2011, she earned her doctorate in English from the University of Kentucky, where she studied 19th century American literature, eco-criticism, and cultural studies theory. In 2012, she joined the Berry Center's work by founding and directing the Berry Farming and Ecological Agrarianism program at St. Catherine College, where she also served as chair of the Department of Earth Studies. Currently, through the partnership with Sterling, Dr. Bayens continues to fine-tune this new agrarian curriculum, calling upon her research in agrarian literature, history, and culture. Her research has been published in the journal Working for Social Justice, Inside and Outside the Classroom, Appalachian Heritage, The Whole Horse Project, The Notebook, a journal for rural women and girls, and What Kind of Ancestor Do You Want to Be? A small note, please take a moment to share this post on your own timeline so your friends and family can join in our appreciation of the liberal arts farmer. Dr. Leah Bayens.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the folks at the Josephine Artery Foundation who made this event possible. Good evening to our friends across the miles. It is a pleasure to speak with you on Earth Day about a place on earth that I hold dear, Henry County, Kentucky. I live in Port Royal, right on the main drag through town leading down to the Kentucky River. From my front porch, I keep my finger on the pulse of Port Royal's goings-on. How often Den Berry stops in at the farm store each day, when the Methodist minister heads out for his daily walk up Cane Run, how the Baptist minister is keeping her bees behind the parsonage, whether Socks, the dog, the mayor of Port Royal, is sunning himself on the blacktop. The Wendell-Berry Farming Program's office is here too, in what used to be a community bank. From behind teller windows, I look out at Parker Farm Supply, a lifeblood of this little hanging-on place. I close my eyes and I imagine how Mary and Wendell and others have described Port Royal as it once was. I reconstruct the stores, refurbish the broken down mechanics shop that now barely stands in for our fire department. and replace the post office trailer with a bricks and mortar affair, open for more than a few hours a week. I open my eyes and I count my blessings for what remains. 2 churches with ministers and parishioners who know what needs to be done and for whom. I follow my little boy, Burley, around the circular drive in the cemetery, marking the neighbors after whom the county roads are named. I breathe a sigh of relief when neighbors from across the county renovate the long abandoned house next door and a family with kids moves in. I reflect on Dalton and Ann Brown's stories about making a good living on land the Berry Center recently acquired as our educational farm. They took good care of it from 1964 to 2019, and the weight of that inheritance is real. Neighbors are watching and curious to see what we will do, how we will farm. And I take an inventory of our strengths. We have the lifelong experience of Ed Fredrickson, who brings ecology to bear in pasture and animal care. We have in Rick Thomas, a teaching teamster and restorative forester, a rare person indeed, who unflinchingly puts novices at the reins of oxen, mules, and horses until they become teamsters too. Jonathan Shepard guides students through business management planning, and with Perry Thomas, we traipse along creeks and rivers, sampling water and learning the signs and practices of watershed health. Local minister Amber Inscore Essick and Henry County born and raised Shannon Boyd shepherd our community life. We have the Berry Center and its efforts to build equitable and ecological farming based on affection for creatures, for people, for place. We have Sterling College and its legacy of hands-on liberal arts, ecology-based education. And most importantly, we have the benefit of local knowledge being passed to us through story, example, and direction. Back in December, Mary Berry shared a talk about this community and its people. In it, she took up the topic, "What a Good Farm Can Teach." Now, as a person whose vocation and calling is education, I think this is just the right way to consider the source of learning and who's doing the teaching: the land, the culture, the place. We could pose the statement any number of ways. What a good culture can teach, what a good community can teach, what nature can teach. Culture, community, land, these teach the liberal arts farmer. And as Wendell Berry writes in Healing, the teachers are everywhere, what is wanted is a learner. We've gathered together such a group of learners in the Wendell Berry Farming Program of Sterling College. This is a 2-year tuition-free program. Students complete junior and senior year coursework to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sustainable Agriculture from Sterling, which is a member of the Work Colleges Consortium. Our first cohort of 12 students will be graduating this May, and we are recruiting a second cohort of 12 students who will begin in August. Their tuition costs are covered through support from the Novell Foundation, grant funds for which the students might be eligible, and participation in our work program. The students complete a senior year capstone project that sets them up for farm enterprises. Some of our students are already farming, so they're fine-tuning production and marketing plans, or they are poised to start new farming ventures. Others are just starting their farm operations, so they have farm business plans in hand and connections established. A few are ready for farm management positions or for launching farm-related businesses and services. Taken together, they're a promising group committed to each other, to farming, and to the land. It's heartening to know that they understand the hard road ahead and that they are prepared to take it. The 12 students who joined the inaugural cohort possess all the qualities you generally want in a student. They're smart, curious, hardworking, and they want to make a difference, and they do. Beyond that, though, they accept the reality that nature has its own standards of quality and systems of judgment, and that local cultures and places matter. In the essay, The Whole Horse, Wendell Berry describes this as an agrarian standard. He differentiates agrarianism from industrialism. Quote, "Whereas industrialism is a way of thought based on monetary capital and technology, agrarianism is a way of thought based on land." He continues, "An agrarian economy rises up from the fields, woods, and streams, from the complex of soils, slopes, weathers, connections, influences, and exchanges that we mean when we speak, for example, of the local community or the local watershed. The agrarian mind is therefore not regional or national, let alone global, but local. It must know on intimate terms the local plants and animals and local soils. It must know local possibilities and impossibilities, opportunities and hazards. It depends and insists on knowing very particular local histories and biographies, end quote. So defining agrarianism as a practice, a set of attitudes, a loyalty, and a passion that's based on land positions nature as the leader, the teacher, and it helps us to conceive of conserving cultures, economies, and practices, agricultural and otherwise, that emerge from thoroughgoing ways of knowing specific local places. So defining agrarianism as a way of thought based on land also expands agrarian identity beyond farming. On this point, Berry writes, quote, though agrarianism proposes that everyone has agrarian responsibilities, it does not propose that everybody should be a farmer or that we don't need cities, end quote. So our students heard the call of an agrarian standard, which is inherently also a call to the work for the common good, for equity and dignity and neighborliness. Their way of channeling that is through farming. Through farming, they grab hold of and learn from and raise up the salvageable bits remaining of whole horse cultures, so to speak. Farming is the means by which they try to put to right the losses incurred by violence against the land and its people. And ultimately, through farming, they learn how to belong to a place. That's a lot for any person to take up, and it requires an education that does more than a practical education alone can do, more than a liberal education alone can do. Obviously, farmers need countless technical skills, assisting with calving, fixing the tractor, building fences, working cattle and sheep, knowing when to plant, penciling out costs, driving a team of mules, as the case may be. But these technical skills don't occur in a vacuum. They always and ever derive from cultures, which in turn arise from interactions with the land community. Farmers need to be able to interpret all manner of landscapes, physical, ecological, economic, and cultural. They must rely on history, literature, soil science, geology, cultural studies, and the like to know what they're looking at, what they're working with, and the context of their lives. As Mary Berry pointed out in December, quote, it seems to me that to learn to be at home in a particular place, not to ask of it more than it can bear, and to leave it better than you found it, is the highest use of a liberal arts education. Because we have lost so much of the culture of good land use when get big and get out became the agricultural policy of this country, young people will need the knowledge of the great agrarian canon to which my father belongs. They will need these books for information and companionship. They will need the arts, cooking, gardening, music, and literature, so that they can make their own subsistence and entertainment. They need examples of people who have lived such lives, end quote. In short, we need the liberal arts farmer. Wendell Berry spells out the particulars in The Unsettling of America. He says, farmers should be educated liberally and practically as farmers. Education should be given and acquired with the understanding that those so educated would return to their home communities, not merely to be farmers corrected and improved by their learning, but also to assume the trusts and obligations of community leadership, the highest form of that vigilant and distrustful superintendence without which the communities could not preserve themselves. So we took this idea to heart and dubbed our program a major in homecoming, one that, as Wendell's friend and colleague Wes Jackson of the Land Institute in Kansas says, quote, prepares the young to return home or to go some other place and dig in. Given the exodus of people from farming communities, we deem it especially important for people to settle into the nooks and crannies and hollers of rural places and to know how to rely on nature as the measure for their land use. So when Mary Berry founded the Berry Center in 2011, one of its first initiatives was to develop a curriculum that merges the practical and liberal arts in its farming education, now known, of course, as the Wendell Berry Farming Program of Sterling College. Based in Henry County, Kentucky, The farming program puts into educational practice Sterling College's motto, "Working hands, working minds," and the Berry Center's mission to advocate for farmers, land-conserving communities, and healthy regional economies. Now, we started with higher education for several reasons. Mary recognized the enormous pressure exerted on young people in farming communities to earn a college degree. But when they go to college, even, or maybe even especially, to study agriculture, they're generally tutored in the edicts of upward mobility, which rarely includes a return to one's home place, especially if it's a rural community. In colleges and universities, agricultural education generally doesn't educate farmers as farmers. Graduates enter ag biotech and agribusiness and ag research. By and large, this form of education has become so specialized and commoditized that it's divorced from the particularities of place and from the proper union of practical and liberal arts. Historian Angus Wright delineates this split when agricultural sciences became housed primarily in research institutions and then transformed into technical disciplines bent on increasing production. In the essay Biological Diversity, Agriculture, and the Liberal Arts, our friend David Orr points out that in this framework, agricultural science lacked a foundation in social, political, ecological, or philosophical contexts. There was no framework in place for challenging the, quote, consequences of applying industrial techniques to complex biological and cultural systems, end quote. Orr argues that if the academic disciplines of agriculture had taken root in the liberal arts, farmers may have learned to see farming not as a production problem to be fixed, but as a more complex activity at once cultural, ethical, ecological, and political. Now, more broadly, the reality of knowledge dictates that the practical arts and the liberal arts cannot stand alone. They depend on one another. As Wendell Berry puts it in The Unsettling of America, without the balance of historic value, practical education gives us that most absurd of standards, relevance, based upon the suppositional need of a theoretical future. But liberal education, divorced from practicality, gives something no less absurd: the specialist professor of one or another of the liberal arts, the custodian of an inheritance he has learned much about, but nothing from. A similar absurdity arises from the separation of culture and agriculture. The term culture is rooted in Latin cultura and invokes the thoughts and practices of preparing the earth for crops, caring for and honoring auger, a field. These two realms have been effectively severed, another casualty of disciplinary specialization. Cultural studies, the humanities, and various sciences are relegated to the liberal arts lane, and farming is relegated to the technical lane, without so much as a gesture to the arts of the practical. The division is not an accident, and it does not serve the land and the people. Yet it is not an inevitability. So our courses hitch together culture and agriculture through agrarian studies. Now, we realize that it takes more than formal education alone to teach how to be at home in a particular place and to fill the gaps left by the countless damages to farming communities. In The Hidden Wound, Wendell Berry reflects on how cultural knowledge is passed on. He writes, "Going day after day about the work of my little farm, I began to have a sense of the 1,000 acts, properly honored and understood, generation after generation, that are necessary to surround a man with a culture sufficient to his life in a given place." David Orr rightly points out that farms did what no other institution has ever done as well. They taught directly, and sometimes painfully, the relationship between our daily bread and soil, rain, animals, biological diversity, and natural cycles, which is to say land stewardship. They also taught the human qualities of husbandry, patience, hard work, self-reliance, practical skill, and thrift. Through the structures of formal education, we're trying to provide organic occasions for learning like this. And our goals are unique in agricultural education: to interweave a hands-on liberal arts farming curriculum with a diversified mid-scale livestock farm using mixed power systems, that is, draft animal and combustion power. We are working to contribute as we are able to the survival of family-scale farms by studying how to be profitable within ecological bounds. We're trying to find examples of conserving farming, forestry, and land use, and to learn from them. And ultimately, we're also trying to find and learn from examples of community cohesion that bend toward a justice based in affection, obligation, and interdependence, and to use these as guides for shaping a culture that supports farming that is equitable, diverse, parity-based, and resilient. To do this, Henry County is our classroom. And to this end, students work with neighboring farmers, economists, advocacy groups, and the Berry Center staff. Much of our work and learning takes place on the Berry Center farm, a 200-acre parcel of land in Port Royal, which is ideally suited for grass farming and a diversity of livestock. The farm has 50 acres of woodland that will benefit from a worst first management plan aimed to improve the health of the woods while providing lumber, a small income, and a classroom. The Windowberry farming program uses grass, livestock, and forest like three legs of a stool in a model that is biologically based and economically viable. Courses combined with the work program are organized according to what Amish farmer David Klein calls the round of the country year, to follow the agricultural calendar as closely as possible. The curriculum connects literature, history, cultural studies, and the arts to agroecology, power systems, forestry, business, policy, and rural leadership. We carefully group together complementary courses across disciplines and talk with students about the big picture connections and relationships between classes. We scaffold the curricular arc so that students build on competencies over time. In these ways, a farmer learns to make decisions informed by pasture ecology and geology, experiences and conversations with neighbors, as well as by history and poetry. We integrate our work and learning with the Berry Center's initiatives, an agrarian archive and library that shows the richness of rural communities, an agrarian culture center which brings humanities programs to our community, the Our Home Place Meat program, a local cooperative marketing-based program that applies the principles of the Burley Tobacco Cooperative to livestock production. We are surrounded by people who open their farms and woods and homes to us. The Fiechters and the Monroes at Valley Spirit Farm, the Willis families at Place on Earth CSA Farm, Bonnie Cecil and John Grant's sheep farm, the list goes on. With Den Berry, we learn breeding for calving ease, fencing, watering systems, accessing grants, geology, forestry, his family history, and even body jokes. Access to so many working farms, forests, and families allows faculty to illuminate the stakes of coursework on soil, plant, and animal health, of an economics of frugality and cooperation, of scale and capacity. We are so grateful for the generosity of neighbors like John Logan Brent, a farmer and our county judge executive. While housing a crop of tobacco or during a planning session to thwart abusive land use, he fills us in on where we are and how we got here, from the stability of parity and cooperative marketing-based agricultural economies to the untenable instability of constantly fluctuating, ever expensive ones. John Logan's mind instinctively wraps together the cultural, economic, social, and biological pieces of the scene. He is not alone. Tom and Janet Grissom have allowed our students to learn restorative forestry practices using draft animals to harvest red cedar on their land along Drennon Creek. With them, we have studied the woodland inventory as well as the abandoned subsistence homesteads there. We have pored over historical aerial photographs of the property to track land use patterns, all within the context of what was happening in the community during these times, what economic, social, and political forces drove the homesteaders away. We fill out the picture with the long view of the history of the Drennon Creek area, where mammoth, buffalo, and deer trampled a road 2 wagons wide to the salt springs there. Indigenous people during the woodland, archaic, and ancient periods gathered, gardened, farmed, and hunted here. They took in the medicinal sulfur springs and made salt from its saline waters, which they traded along the intra-regional so-called warriors' path. Their descendants, members of Cherokee, Shawnee, and Osage groups, made their lives here. In 1773, speculators John Drennon and Matthew Bracken secretly broke off from the McAfee expedition and, led by a Native American guide, made their way to the springs. George Rogers Clark later claimed the land, and the Land Court of Kentucky County, Virginia, granted the claim. These claims of possession led to violent dispossession of indigenous use. The land became property, and so began a history of predominantly white ownership and control. From the earliest days of Euro-American settlement, African Americans who were enslaved worked and lived there. The ecological and cultural landscape changed utterly. We trace these lines not to vilify, but to understand who has lived here and how they have lived. At the most basic level, farmers benefit from this kind of information because it sheds light on nature's measure, what grows here with or without human influence, what should be here now but isn't. What are the effects of introducing non-native species? How can native cultigens of sunflower, giant ragweed, and maygrass be used? Entwined with these practical aspects, of course, are the social aspects farmers ought to consider. What undergirds our contemporary cultural, social, economic, and ecological circumstances? How can understanding the particularities of people's actions and their effects, both positive and negative, help imagine what's possible in farming and in agricultural communities? All the people here now and in the past, white and black and brown, have been human in all their ways of being human. They've been fallible, loving, hard, curious, sinful, repentant, biased, forgiving. We would do well to remember that if we have any chance of calling people into a community. The liberal arts farmer will make decisions that take into account the entwined natural and cultural history and present of our place, especially the power dynamics involving class, race, and gender. So we consider Wendell Berry's assertion in The Hidden Wound that America's foundations of class and race-based injustices are rooted in, quote, an inordinate desire to be superior, not to some inferior or subject people, though this desire leads to the subjection of people, but to our condition. We wish to rise above the sweat and bother of taking care of anything, of ourselves, of each other, of our country, end quote. As people whose livelihood depends on physical labor, farmers should understand the roots of attitudes about labor and the hierarchies that develop as a result. It is no wonder that people on the short end of a demoralizing stick want no part of it, yet too seldom has the answer been to elevate and respect the work and the person. Too often, we have treated symptoms rather than causes. In The Hidden Wound, Wendell talks about this vision, and it's one that we've taken up, and this is rather lengthy, but I'll read it out. Quote, a true and appropriate answer to our race problem, as to many others, would be a restoration of our communities, it being understood that a community, properly speaking, cannot exclude or mistreat any of its members. This is what we forgot during slavery and the industrialization that followed and have never remembered. A proper community, we should remember, is also a commonwealth, a place, a resource, an economy. It answers the needs, practical as well as social and spiritual, of its members. Among them, the need to need one another. The answer to the present alignment of political power with wealth is the restoration of the identity of community and economy, end quote. Along the banks of Drennon Creek, under the shadow of Maddox Ridge, and on the steps of the little white Christian church whose parishioners' headstones are on Native American sacred grounds, we reflect on Wendell Berry's description in The Unsettling of America. The fact that the colonists who drove off the Indians came to be intolerably exploited by their imperial governments, and the alien imperialism was thrown off only to be succeeded by a domestic version of the same thing. The class of independent small farmers who fought the War of Intendances has been exploited by and recruited into the industrial society until by now it's almost extinct. The only escape from this destiny of victimization has been to, quote unquote, succeed, that is, to make it into the class of exploiters, and then to remain so specialized and so mobile as to be unconscious of the effects of one's life or livelihood. This escape is, of course, illusory, for one man's producer is another man's consumer, and even the richest and most mobile will soon find it hard to escape the noxious effluence and fumes of their various public services. Let me emphasize that I am not talking about an evil that is merely contemporary or modern, but one that is as old as America, in America, as the white man's presence here. It is an intention that was organized here almost from the start." End quote. This is where we are and how we got here. We are not merely in a moment of crisis of race, gender, and class inequities. It is a perpetuous wound that harms us all. But it is mixed together with goodness that emerges from genuine affection between people and place. So in the Drennon Springs churchyard, we read Wendell's poem, A Vision, the ending of which carries us on. "Memory, native to this valley, will spread over it like a grove, and memory will grow into legend, legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds, will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its reality." These words make me think of the members of the local historic African American fraternity, the Odd Fellows, and the NABVETS, the National Association for Black Veterans, who take us around the county to shed light on the Black agrarian history and present of Henry County, of Kentucky, of the United States, that is complicated, punctuated by interracial and intraracial antagonisms as well as affections. The NABVETS and Odd Fellows' kindness is a graciousness that I can hardly fathom. They understand that we have lost much of the local culture that passes knowledge from one generation to another, and that we need one another. A farming community would do well to define its membership as broadly as the ever raucous character Burley Coulter does in Barry's short story, The Wild Birds. Burley says to his lawyer friend Wheeler Catlett, "The way we are members of each other, all of us, everything. The difference ain't in who is a member and who is not, but in who knows it and who don't." Burley's idea that we are members of each other, all of us, everything, is about as inclusive a definition of membership as I know. It's saying that we're connected and responsible to one another and to the land, whether we know it or not and whether we acknowledge it or not. We're always and already members of agrarian communities and agrarian lineages. So in our classes, we think about and try to live out the responsibilities this membership requires of us, and also revel in the perks of that membership too. A diverse agrarian literary lineage helps liberal arts farmers understand their own membership and inheritances. We study a sampling of texts by writers and artists whose work reflects and shapes the thoughts, practices, and cultures of farming lives. Virgil, Aldo Leopold, F.H. King, Liberty Hyde Bailey, Sir Albert Howard, Masanobu Fukuoka, Masanobu Fukuoka, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Frank X. Walker, Vandana Shiva, David and Elsie Klein, Leah Penniman, Bessie Head, Winona LaDuke, Frederick Douglass, Wendell Berry, obviously, Crystal Wilkinson, and so many more. We glean from these examples of equipment for living, as philosopher Kenneth Burke put it, that is, essential strategies for living well in a place. In short, through interdisciplinary agrarian studies, we are raising liberal arts farmers. These are people who know how to be good neighbors and good stewards of the land, air, and water. They know how to drive a team of mules, and they know the socio-political significance of mules in the South, and of the influence of race and class in draft power systems. They know how to help a lamb and ewe bond when needed. They have teetered along rocky creek beds with geologists to understand our soil composition. They know how to maintain their own dignity and others' dignity when engaging prickly conversations, and in this way, they also know how to say the hard thing that needs to be said. This is a replicable model of education for creating agrarians, for forming young people who know how to be from a place. Wendell Berry says of this curriculum, "This farming program is exactly what most needs doing here. It's a pleasure to do it." In closing, I leave you with a video clip of some of our current students whose words represent our group of liberal arts farmers. Thank you.
You know, coming into the Wendell-Berry farming program, you kind of assume or expect that you will leave being a better farmer, or, you know, at least having the tools and some kind of background knowledge to move forward with. But the thing that really surprised me the most, you know, I'm leaving a better person. Boastful, but I've learned so much just about the language that we use and how important that is. You know, the people in this program are not afraid to kind of call you out and to hold you accountable and to really hold you to a higher standard in a bunch of aspects of life. And that's one of the things that really took me by surprise, and it's definitely one of the reasons that I have so much respect and adoration for this program. Farming is everything to me. It's real, it's tangible, you can see what you're doing, you can see the impact that you're making, you can see the mistakes that you're making. You know, it's results in real time.
I feel like as a member of the Wendell-Berry farming program, I've really been brought into a community that surrounds you with knowledge and experiences that I wouldn't have otherwise had. And in turn, I'm bringing my knowledge and experiences here as well, and we're able to build something better together as a group.